Okay, good evening. Welcome through to our latest webinar series. I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Dr. Ceri Bradshaw. Ceri teaches on our psychology degrees, both at undergraduate level as well as postgraduate level. So I'm really pleased to say that we're joined by her this evening to share with us this informative topic. So we hope you enjoy the session. We will take questions at the end, and you can do that by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel for those of you who are joining us live. Those of you watching this on record, then please do email us if you have any questions, and that email address to use is study@swansea.ac.uk. Okay, over to you, Ceri.
Thanks, Emma. Well, thank you all for joining this evening on this beautiful sunny day in Swansea. I hope it is sunny elsewhere too. I'm very pleased to talk about some of the research that my team and I have been doing in Swansea University. One of my areas of expertise is substance misuse, and we've undertaken some research on the links between the use of cannabis, sleeping and dreams. And I'm going to give a little bit of background to the general topic, and then I'm going to primarily present the background methods and findings of a study that we've done over the last couple of years, which investigates how cannabis users differ slightly to non-cannabis users in terms of their sleeping patterns and their dreaming patterns, and we'll go on to look at why that might be important. It's a little bit of a strange experience, this, because I can't see any of you and I can't see how many people I'm talking to. So it's a bit like talking to just me and Emma. But so I normally, when you're lecturing to a group of students, you sort of judge their understanding by the looks on their faces and sometimes the questions they give you as you're talking. So I'm going to have to just hope that I'm coming across clearly and that you understand what I'm talking about. But this is a fairly straightforward one. There's nothing too complicated, and hopefully you'll enjoy the talk. So a little bit about the background in terms of the use of cannabis. The prevalence of cannabis use across the entire UK population is reported to be 6.6% in one study from 2017. There are different measures by different agencies and investigative teams, but it does tend to be around that mark, sort of 6-7% across the population, although that does vary by demographic. So unsurprisingly, young people are have a much higher incidence of use, and it sort of decreases with age. And some studies have reported recreational cannabis use by students in the UK to be as high as about 25%. So it's a commonly used drug. It may not surprise some of you to know that it is the world's most commonly used illicit drug for the places where it is illicit, which is most of the world. It's not as common as the three most common drugs. Recreational drugs are all legal they are caffeine is actually the world's most used drug, and then alcohol and tobacco or cigarettes. Obviously, alcohol is not legal everywhere, but largely speaking, those three are illegal drugs. And then the next most abused drug is, or used drug, is the illicit drug of cannabis. Worldwide, the incidence of cannabis use is approximately 2.5%. But as you may know, it is now legal for recreational use. Cannabis is now legal for recreational use in some countries, such as Canada, South Africa, and Uruguay. And it's also been legalized for recreational use, by which we mean using for pleasure and nothing else, in 17 states in the USA. But it's also legal for medical use in a further at least 20 states in the USA. The reason that that number of states for legalization for medicinal use is a little bit approximate there, 20 plus states, is that they can vary a little bit in terms of what they allow. So in some states it's legal for medicinal use, but the THC level, we'll go on to look at the active compounds of cannabis in just a moment. And one of the active compounds is THC. And in some states it is legal, but only below certain levels of THC. And in some states, only the CBD element of cannabis is legal for medicinal use. You may be aware that CBD is completely legal in the UK. You can buy CBD oil in Holland and Barrett. You can buy it in, sometimes in places like vape shops. You can buy it online. We'll have a little look at CBD in a moment and what role that has. So as well as being legal in a few countries and legal in 17 states of the USA, it's also been decriminalized, or it's sort of tolerated. It varies a little bit in terms of the law, but generally speaking, that it's what we can say is that the authorities turn a blind eye to a small amount of personal use. In countries such as Portugal and most famously the Netherlands, which of course is widely famous for allowing cannabis use for personal use, even though it's never actually been legalized, it's just tolerated. In the UK, cannabis is legal for medical use, but it is heavily controlled. And what I mean by that is that it's quite hard to get it. It is legal for medical use, but it's only very rarely prescribed to things like certain kinds of very severe epilepsy that isn't responsive to any other drug, and things like that. You can't get it for more common conditions like arthritis or conditions, joint pain, conditions that some studies have reported that cannabis can be useful for in terms of relieving pain. But CBD is completely legal in the UK, which is not the case everywhere. The ingestion of cannabis occurs probably most commonly by smoking, inhalation, but it can also be consumed as edibles, as they've come to be known, part of a food or drink. And that picture there in the bottom right just shows you these are, so this is, in places like the USA and Canada where cannabis is legal, there are now shops where you can buy cannabis related products, and so there's a whole industry of now creating officially made cannabis edibles. You may be aware that in this country some people buy cannabis and then you make their own edibles, but in other countries they are actually produced and sold, like mass produced. So they are some of the edibles that are available, but I mean, largely speaking, you can put cannabis in anything you can make, really, if you want to ingest it that way, or if one wants to ingest it that way, I should say. Edible cannabis is more popular in the USA and Canada, where smoking is very unpopular and very stigmatized. If cannabis is smoked in those countries, it tends to be smoked alone, as in without tobacco. In Europe, including the UK, the most popular ingestion of cannabis is still by far and away a joint, or some form of smoking it with tobacco. In fact, that split is something like, for those who use cannabis in the USA and Canada, 90% do not smoke it with tobacco. Whereas for those who use cannabis in Europe and the UK, about 70 to 80% do smoke it with tobacco. So it's a really big difference there. The psychoactive components of cannabis, just to give you an idea of what it's doing there, cannabis plants comprise about 113, well not about, the last count was exactly 113 cannabinoids, which are the active compounds, the active enzymes within cannabis that give it a psychoactive quality. The two main psychoactive components are tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and cannabidiol, which is CBD. And these combine to form the psychoactive effects in the cannabis plant. THC is significantly more psychoactive than CBD in terms of its effects. So when we talk about something being psychoactive, we mean that it has a noticeable effect on the state of your mind. It changes the state of your mind. So THC is the more psychoactive component of cannabis, with both psychedelic and anxiolytic qualities. So psychedelic properties are mildly hallucinogenic properties, so the bit that makes you feel sort of spaced out, or makes people feel high basically. And the anxiolytic qualities, anxiolytic there meaning reducing anxiety, so that's the bit that makes people feel relaxed and calm, and now CBD has far less, certainly significantly less psychoactive effect, and actually whether or not it has much of a psychoactive effect at all is quite debated really, because the evidence is very mixed. So it is reported to have positively relieving effects on some things like anxiety and pain, or some people who feel a bit nervous or a bit out of sorts. But really, when you look at the evidence from clinical trial, the evidence is very mixed regarding its efficacy in terms of whether it's doing much, and it may greatly depend on the concentration levels, the type of CBD it is, and also individual differences between people. So it may well be that for some people it has quite a strong positive effect. For some people it might not have much of an effect at all. For other people it might have a almost negative or perhaps a neutral effect. So it's or effects, but effects that are neither good or bad. They're just they're just effects. So CBD is very mixed. However, there is that one thing that we are starting to be able to say quite clearly about the effect of CBD, and that's that it appears to have a positively moderating and mediating effect of this THC in cannabis. It seems to be necessary. I mean, the cannabis plant does have THC and CBD, and the positive effects that people claim to subjectively experience from cannabis if they use it appears to come from the combination of THC with CBD. And that's very easily tested in terms of asking people, in terms of self-report about how they feel, because if you give people THC alone without CBD, pure THC, they tend to like that significantly less than both of them together. It often makes people feel edgy and sort of a bit, they do feel the psychoactive properties of it, but not in a particularly pleasant way. They're not, terribly fond of it. And this is why synthetic cannabis substitutes, like you may have heard of things like spice or things like that are on the street, are firstly a lot less popular with people who like the effects of cannabis, because they have quite different effects, and secondly can have some really quite unpleasant or dangerous effects in a way that cannabis doesn't seem to have. And that's because CBD seems to be mediating the effects of THC in cannabis. It seems to be perhaps sort of calming down and blunting the effects and making them subjectively more pleasant to the user, or making it a calmer, less chaotic and edgy and pleasant effect for the user. So I did tell you that this talk was about cannabis, sleep and dreams, and so let's move on to why this is important. So studies show that THC administration can significantly reduce the duration of REM sleep, that's rapid eye movement sleep, which you may know is one of the important stages of sleep that we have several times every night. Cannabis has also been shown to decrease sleep latency, and what we mean by latency of sleep is the amount of time it takes to fall asleep after you've sort of turned the light off and started to relax. So it seems to make people fall asleep a little bit quicker than if they've been using cannabis than if they haven't. However, cannabis also seems to increase disturbances during sleep, such as the number of awakenings they have during the night, and certain periods of restlessness. But one of the things that's notable is that the effects of cannabis on sleep are not consistently replicated, which means that some studies show an effect of cannabis on REM sleep, for example. Some show an effect on sleep latency, some show an effect on sleep disturbances, but others don't. And this has been going on for a few decades. It's actually quite difficult to get a very firm, clear picture of what's going on with cannabis and sleep. Meanwhile, if you ask people who use cannabis regularly about their sleep quality, they will often say that it improves their sleep quality in self-report studies, and they often feel as though it helps them to sleep. But when you do lab studies and look at them, they often fail to show this effect. It's almost quite strange that people will say it helps them to sleep, and yet when you look at it in a lab, it actually doesn't seem to help them sleep at all. It might actually reduce the quality of their sleep. So the evidence is very mixed there. Now, going back to REM sleep, one of the things that is more consistently noted is that cannabis does seem to have, doesn't always, but does quite regularly in studies show an effect on REM sleep. And you may know, if you've done any work on sleep before, if you looked at sleep at all before, that REM has a really important role in our, so rapid eye movement sleep is the period of sleep where we tend to dream. We tend to have more dreams in REM sleep than any other stage. And it seems to have a very important role in determining the overall quality of our sleep. We're not entirely sure why that is, but it does seem that if people don't have enough REM sleep, even if they have plenty of sleep, but they don't have enough REM sleep, they are not as restored. They don't feel as good the following day. It also, and perhaps for that reason, it also seems to play a part in the efficacy of executive functioning. And executive functioning is our cognitive functioning, which is things like our executive functions are things like working memory, attention, concentration, our ability to hold information in our mind and work with it, to concentrate, and that kind of thing. So if we don't have enough REM sleep, we might be compromised in a cognitive way the following day or in an ongoing way. Meanwhile, the relationships between cannabis and dreaming are less well researched. Dreaming is largely associated with REM sleep, as I've already mentioned, although it can occur to a much lesser degree in other sleep stages. Really, the main findings that can be, there's very little out there in terms of research into cannabis use and dreaming. One of the only findings that you do tend to see sometimes is that a few studies have looked at abstinence in heavy cannabis users. So this is people who are abstaining from cannabis use or trying to give it up after either abstaining because they've been asked to by the lab or specifically purposefully trying to give up cannabis use after a long period of heavy use. And what we find in those studies, okay, and there's very few of them, but on the studies that have looked at this, they found that people often report that they don't dream very much when they use a lot of cannabis, but following abstinence, in the first couple of weeks of abstinence, it's as if their dreams come flooding back and they can have some really vivid, sometimes quite not particularly pleasant, quite chaotic, not always very pleasant dreams. But apart from that, there's really very little out there on cannabis and dreaming. However, we also know that anxiety and memory have links with dream content and recall. So people have different dream functioning when they're anxious, for example, and memory can have a relationship with the extent to which people recall their dreams. Not surprisingly, you know, that people with poorer memories tend to recall their dreams less. And so there may be things like anxiety and memory may mediate the relationships between cannabis use and dreaming, in the sense that people who are anxious might be less likely to remember their dreams or more likely to remember their dreams. And when we look at all of this combined, it might be that if cannabis use is causing a reduction in overall REM sleep, then the reduced REM and the reduced dreaming as a function, if you have less REM sleep, then you are likely to dream a lot less. And this may have a role in the sort of hangover effects of cannabis use, which are sometimes seen in terms of people feeling quite tired and having quite poor memory and poor concentration the following day. So rather than it being directly as a result of simply from taking the drug, it might be that the part of the reason for the tiredness and the reduced executive functions, cognitive functions, actually come from a reduction of REM sleep that has occurred because of the use of cannabis. And that's the rationale behind this study that I am going to report to you. So limitations of previous research in this area include the fact that most research conducted on cannabis use and sleep occurs in the laboratory under very controlled conditions, which is great for control in terms of making it a very scientific study, but which don't resemble typical sleep circumstances for regular cannabis users. It can be really quite difficult to, you know, sleep in a lab with EEG equipment all over you and, you know, being watched all night. It's not the most relaxing of circumstances. Therefore, if you're looking to measure the effect of cannabis on sleep, it might not be ideal to try and watch people in the lab because their sleep is going to be altered anyway. And this might be one of the reasons for mixed evidence in relation to cannabis use and sleep, because it really stems from the lab conditions rather than the cannabis use. Another issue with previous research is that very often lab studies will use controlled THC doses, which again is very good for scientific control, but doesn't always resemble typical cannabis use. Sometimes they use THC alone, which, as I've already talked about, can be quite a harsh, unpleasant compound. Or it might be the fact that the way in which they are administered the cannabis might differ in terms of the amount they normally use or the method of ingestion. Dreaming, as I've already said, is largely ignored when it comes to measuring cannabis use and sleep. So with these in mind, we wanted to create a study that aimed to assess the effects of regular cannabis use compared to non-use in terms of objective sleep measures. And by this, I mean brain scan EEG measures of sleep, very objective brain scan measures. Self-reported sleep quality, so the participants tell you about the night's sleep they've had, dream reports from the participants, and then also looking at anxiety and memory, because as we've talked about, these could have a role as well. And at the same time as measuring these things, we also wanted to pilot a novel paradigm of measuring sleep at home, and this is, you know, for this study, for the cannabis study, but also for any type of study where you want to look at people's sleep patterns, using a specially designed headband, small headband, which can measure PSG stands for polysomnography, which is about measuring sleep basically, which is measuring the brain waves using EEG equipment. So we wanted to pilot a small study and ask participants to take this little piece of equipment home, wear it to bed, and then we could take the measures from it. It's got a little memory card inside. They give it back to us. We take the memory card out, put it in our computers, and then we've got objective measures of their sleep all night. So our predictions were that cannabis users would show decreased percentage of REM sleep compared to non-using controls. That cannabis users would show reduced sleep latency. Remember, that's how long it takes to get to sleep. So they get to sleep faster than non-using controls. That cannabis users would show reduced dream recall compared to controls, that they wouldn't remember as many dreams. And that cannabis users would show some differences in dream content compared to non-using controls. Now that is a picture of the headband. That's one of our team on the left there, Michelle, and that's a picture of her wearing the headband. So that's that bit there is the actual little mini tiny brain scanner, which goes on the prefrontal cortex there and just measures what's going on in the brain. And those pictures below show the headband, and the one on the right, which is the white, the image on the right of each of those images, which is the white, is shows sticky pads which keep, so the band that goes around the temples there is elastic, you know, it's like a thick elastic headband, and then it comes together around the back of the head with Velcro, but behind that are these pads, which are the electrodes, which are the conductive parts, which actually read the, you know, what's going on in your brain there. So it's called the Hypnodyne Z-Max. You know, more of an American pronunciation there, and it's a portable sleep acquisition system which allows EEG, and EOG is eye movement, so it just measures eye movements round here, as well as because eye movements are a good measure of REM sleep, because rapid eye movement, you know, we move our eyes around a lot when we're dreaming. So participants sleep at home in their usual environments. They come into the lab. We haven't done this study for over a year, even though we like to collect a bit more data, because we haven't been able to do face-to-face testing or give people pieces of equipment, obviously, during the pandemic. So we last collected data from this about a year, last January, I think. Participants would attend a lab session to learn how to use the Z-Max headband, and they'd be given a bit of training, and then it's very, very straightforward to use, and then they take it home to use it over several nights. We'd take 2 nights of data if we could. We do lose a lot of data with the study. It's one of those ones where you have to expect that you're quite often going to lose data because people forget to take it off. Sometimes some people get uncomfortable and just take it off in the middle of the night without even waking up. They don't even know they're doing it. Sometimes the data is just a little bit unreadable. It's just technology, it goes wrong. So, but most of the time it's light and relatively unobtrusive to sleep. I've slept in it and found it completely fine and produced 2 good nights of data. So this is a small pilot study. We had 12 regular cannabis users who used cannabis at least 3 times a week. Most of them used more, like at least 5 or 6 times a week or every night. I think there was only one participant who used 3 times a week, and 9 non-users who never used and have never used, or haven't used in the last sort of year at least. The participants were mostly students aged 19 to 27, and almost half of them were female, so they were a good gender split. They used no other drugs and drank no alcohol on the nights that they were being tested, because that would interfere with it. And in line with the worldwide data, the most common form of, well, I think the only form of cannabis used actually was smoking in joints with tobacco. I don't think anybody used cannabis in any other way. And the range of the number of joints smoked was between 1 and 15 per day. So we have got some very heavy smokers going on there. They slept at home under normal conditions, wearing the ZMax headband for 2 nights. That's both the cannabis users and the controls. The participants in the experimental group reported nightly cannabis use, as in they filled in a questionnaire to say how much cannabis they'd used every night. And they were awoken several times during the nights by alarms, which you can set on the headband, or we can ask them to set on their phone. And when they were woken up in the middle of the night, they provided dream reports if they'd had a dream. And then I think we outwoke them 4 times during the night. And then when they woke up in the morning, they filled in another dream report if they'd had a dream, and the final questionnaires. The sleep measures on the left there, that is a screenshot of the computer, which shows some of the measures that we get, the PSG measures from the headband. And we took measures such as the total minutes of sleep, the number of arousals during the night. Everybody wakes up many, many times during the night. They just don't know. They don't remember it. They're not like properly conscious. Sleep latency, i.e. length of time to fall asleep. REM latency, which is the amount of time it takes to first enter REM sleep when you go to sleep at night. REM duration across the entire night, and percentage of REM as a function of total sleep. Because if you just take REM duration, then it tends to relate to how long someone slept for. So someone who slept for 9 hours will have a lot more REM sleep than someone who slept for 5 hours. So we have to take percentage REM as a measure of whether they're having more REM throughout their sleep overall. The self-report measures were the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, the PSQI, which is a common measure of sleep quality. We took a measure of everyday memory, which is, you know, how good is your memory on a day-to-day basis. State trait anxiety index, so that was a measure of anxiety. The Rutgers Marijuana Problem Index is a measure of how many problems they have in life caused by cannabis, you know, from cannabis use. And then we measured their lifetime cannabis use and their nightly cannabis use, more so in those who used cannabis, obviously. They also provided brief dream reports and rated their dreams for sensory experience, emotionality, and bizarreness. So sensory experiences, whether they experienced a lot in a sensory way, whether it was sensory experience relates to vividness, emotionality, how emotional they were, and how bizarre they were. And these are the findings. For the objective sleep measures, we found no significant differences between cannabis users and controls in total minutes of sleep, sleep latency, or total number of arousals. However, we did find significant differences between the groups in REM latency, i.e. how long it took them to go into REM sleep, with a p-value of 0.04. And you can see there that the cannabis users, from the means, that's the means and the standard deviation, took significantly longer to go into REM sleep, and really a big effect. So they're taking about almost 120 minutes to first go into REM sleep, whereas the controls are only taking about 79, 80 minutes. So we are talking a difference there of about 40 minutes for cannabis users to go into REM sleep. And we also found a significant difference between the overall percentage of REM sleep. So cannabis users, about 18.9% of their overall sleep was REM sleep, whereas for the controls, they were having about a quarter, about 25% of their night was. So there is a difference there. They are getting less REM sleep and they're taking longer to go into REM sleep. For the self-report measures, we found no differences between the cannabis users and controls in self-reported sleep quality from the PSQI, in anxiety, or in everyday memory. So they reported being much the same, the participants in these two groups. However, not surprisingly, the cannabis users reported significantly more problems in terms of their cannabis use from the RMPI. At a very high significance level there, small significance level, so it's 0.005. Now you might say, well, why did you measure problems from cannabis use in people who don't use cannabis? It's because a lot of the problems are things that could occur anyway, like problems with work or study or relationships. And what this is showing is that people who use cannabis are experiencing some life effects in perhaps a negative way from their heavy use of cannabis. So it's just more of a covariant, really, to show that it is affecting them. There were no significant differences in dream measures in terms of percentage of dream recall, how much they recall dreams, the length of their dreams, or the emotionality, the vividness of their dreams, or that should say, the vividness, which is the sensory experience. However, there was a significant difference on the bizarreness of dreams. Cannabis users reported a mean bizarre score of 4.68, whereas the controls reported a mean bizarre score of 3.65 in their dreams. So cannabis users' dreams were more bizarre. So what conclusions can we draw from our findings here? Well, this is the first study of its kind to study sleep at home with cannabis use in this way. This is quite new technology, and not much has been done on this before. So this is the first study that we know of that's actually measured sleep, and that the overall strength of it is that it's extremely ecologically valid. The cannabis users and the non-users, the control group, didn't alter the way that they did things in any way. We asked them to just do what they would normally do. Smoke cannabis or not, as they would normally do. Go to bed whatever time you would normally go to bed. Just do whatever you would normally do. And no other study has really been able to do this, because they've always had to bring subjects into the lab to test them. So then the participants are never doing what they would normally do. So it should be treated as a pilot study with encouraging findings to go on to perhaps repeat this study and see what else we can find from this kind of research. Significant differences emerged between cannabis users and non-cannabis users on REM latency, REM percentage, problem use of cannabis, and bizarreness in dreams. There were no other significant findings. We can conclude from that cannabis use appears to affect the structure, the architecture of sleep in terms of the relative placement and quantity of REM. So cannabis use appears to be having an effect on REM sleep in a significant way. We know that REM sleep is important for feeling refreshed after sleep, and the optimum functioning of executive functions like memory and attention can be reduced by not having enough REM sleep. So cannabis use may be affecting our function in the following day in one way by reducing our REM sleep if people use the drug. Higher dream bizarreness scores in the cannabis users may stem from the psychedelic nature of the drug. It is classed as a hallucinogen, a psychedelic drug. So the bizarreness of the dreams might reflect that. You will probably be thinking, well, this study does have some, obvious limitations. It does. It's a very small sample size. However, some of the differences that were non-significant were actually quite big. For example, cannabis users had a 25% dream recall compared to 44% dream recall in the controls. So they did actually recall their dreams less in terms of what they reported. But this difference was non-significant statistically, and that's probably down to the small sample size. So to increase the sample size and balance out the group sizes there might affect the statistical power and give us firmer conclusions. The cannabis use, the biggest problem is that both the cannabis use and the sleep is uncontrolled, but that was part of the study design. We are dependent on their self-report for knowing what their cannabis use was. We didn't measure it with biological measures, and that is definitely a limitation of the study. It gives us very good ecological validity, but poor control over the amount of cannabis they had. But this study could be used to inform a bigger study where cannabis quantities, are controlled. So the findings provide encouragement for further studies of this kind, and in particular, more investigation into the effects of cannabis use on sleep, particularly at REM sleep and onto dreaming. Okay, so thank you ever so much for your time and for listening to this presentation. I will take some questions, but I'm going to hand back to Emma for a minute before I do that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ceri. Fascinating.
No problem.
Yeah, really, really great session. So those of you, just to say before we end the recording, if you're watching this back on record, as we said, please do email us if you have specific questions. We'll ensure they get sent over to Ceri. Or if you've got any questions about any of the courses on offer with us here at Swansea, please do get in touch with us. And the email address to use is study@swansea.ac.uk. Thank you for watching. Okay, I'm just going to end the recording.